So today we're going to be making meatloaf, and this has always been one of my favorite things to eat. Going back to when I was a kid, I've always loved meatloaf. And I'm going to be making the whole meal too, because meatloaf wouldn't be complete without mashed potatoes and gravy and green beans and bacon. And honestly, when you think of the term all-American dinner, there aren't many meals out there that exemplify that term better than the meatloaf dinner does. It's truly humble, delicious comfort food at its finest. So what do you say we make some food? Okay, we're gonna start things off by getting our vegetables ready, and I'm just using a standard mixture of onions, celery, and carrots, and within the culinary galaxy, this mixture is known as mirepoix, but you could add in whatever you think sounds good or whatever you have lying around. Mushrooms, bell peppers, and jalapenos are all pretty good options. You want to make sure to keep the dice small though. A 1/4 inch or less is ideal here, that way they're not falling out all over the place when it comes time to shaping the loaf or when you go to carve slices out. And since I'm going to be using 2 pounds of meat inside the loaf I'm making today, I'm shooting for about 6 to 8 ounces of vegetables to mix in. This is a good ratio to keep in mind when making meatloaf. Okay, moving over to the stovetop, add 2 to 3 minced garlic cloves, 1 tablespoon of butter, and a few pinches of salt to the pan. Set the heat to medium, and we're going to sweat these out for about 5 minutes. We're not looking to get any color here, we're just looking to soften them up a little bit. So looking at what I'm doing here, you might be asking yourself, why am I pre-cooking these vegetables if it's all going to get mixed together and cooked in the oven in the end anyway? Well, the reason is that the cell structure of these vegetables breaks down at a much higher temperature than what we're going to bring the meatloaf to. If the meatloaf gets much over 145 or 150, it's going to be overcooked and dried out. And these vegetables break down and soften up at around 180, so that's why we're pre-cooking them. You don't want to have crunchy vegetables in the meatloaf. They should be soft and tender, and these are looking pretty good, so let's take them off the heat and get the rest of our mix-ins ready. Start by whisking 2 eggs together until they're fully broken apart, and to that we're going to add a 1/4 teaspoon each of chili powder and garlic powder, along with a 1/2 teaspoon of oregano, a 1.5 cups of panko breadcrumbs, 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, a 1/2 cup of buttermilk, 2.5 teaspoons of salt, along with our cooked vegetable mixture from earlier. And we're going to mix everything together until it becomes homogeneous. The mixture of breadcrumbs and buttermilk is a binding agent known as panade or panada, which is a general term used for a starchy mixture used to bind force meats together. However, that's not the only form of panade. Cooked rice or potatoes that have been pureed until smooth is another form of panade, as is pâte à choux, which is primarily used in the bake shop for cream puffs and eclairs. Now when you're making meatloaves or meatballs, soaking some form of bread inside some form of dairy is primarily what you're going to be using. But I wanted to point out something that I haven't seen other YouTubers point out, and that's that this is not the only form of panade. And for the meat here, I'm going to be using 2 pounds of ground beef, and it's often recommended to use a mixture of ground beef, pork, and veal, with the idea being that you get most of your flavor from the beef, you get the richness from the pork fat, and the veal contains gelatin, which helps with binding. But the reason why I'm using only ground beef is mostly practicality. Most stores don't have ground veal on the shelves, so it can be hard to come by. And let's be honest, unless your family was a lot more bourgeois than mine, the meatloafs you had growing up were made from ground beef. Okay, we're ready to add the meat now, so go ahead and plop it into the bowl, and to point out another ratio to keep in your back pocket, for every 1 pound of meat, use 3/4 cup of breadcrumbs, 1 egg, and a teaspoon of salt. And another thing to point out here is that the mixture can be overworked at this point. The protein strands within the beef can tangle together and form bonds, and that can create a tough, dried out meatloaf. We've all had a burger that someone made that you had to chew for like 4 hours to eat it. Mix it until there are no large visible chunks of the meat or the panade mixture left, and stop when you reach that point. And I'd say we're looking pretty good here, so grab a sheet tray, line it with parchment paper, and plop the loaf out onto the tray to shape it out. And if you want rounded or squared edges, make them however you want, but don't worry about small imperfections, just shape it out to a consistent thickness and density so it can cook evenly in the oven. Okay, so we've got our meatloaf here, and I'm preheating this oven to 375 degrees. And I want to point out that prior to preheating this oven, I allowed this meatloaf to rest for 30 minutes. And what that does is it allows the panade to bind everything together, and with that you'll be able to get clean, smooth slices that don't fall apart. And I also want to point out that I'm using a sheet tray here and not a loaf pan. And what the sheet tray does is it creates better air circulation, which promotes better surface browning. If you cook these things in loaf pans, they sort of awkwardly simmer and you end up with this shitty, slimy meatloaf in the end. So a sheet tray is the way to go. So into the oven we go, and while that's in there, let's get our side dishes ready. Start by placing a small pot of water over medium to high heat, add a pinch of salt, and let's cut up some potatoes. And while most people prefer russet potatoes for mashing, I kind of like red potatoes and Yukon Golds. Go with your own personal preference here. Russets will give a lighter, fluffier consistency, and waxy potatoes like I'm using will give a more rich, dense, creamy consistency. And all I'm doing here is roughly cutting them down so they cook faster. You could peel them if you want, but I kind of like the rustic style of leaving the skins on. Once you have them cut up and the water reaches a boil, go ahead and toss the potatoes in. Drop the heat down to a simmer, and while that gets ready, let's turn our attention to our gravy. And for that, place a pot over medium heat, add 2 tablespoons of butter, and once that melts, add a small amount of mirepoix to the pot, which again is a mixture of onion, celery, and carrots. So give that a stir and cook it for a few minutes until the vegetables take on a bit of color along the edges. Then we're going to work in 2.5 tablespoons of flour along with 2 teaspoons of tomato paste. And the combination of butter and flour is known as roux, and this is what's going to thicken the gravy up. And after a few minutes of cooking, the roux will darken up slightly. Then we can gradually work in 2 cups of beef stock, and I emphasize the word gradually because this is how you prevent lumps from forming. And once you have all the stock added in, add a few pinches of salt and 1 bay leaf, and while that heats up, let's turn our attention back to our potatoes. And what you're looking for in the potatoes is for them to be fully softened, and you could pierce them with a fork, but there are also a few visual indicators, such as this one breaking apart a little bit, and you can also see the outer edges peeling away around the skin. So these are done and ready to be strained out, and back over at the gravy pot, it's reached a boil, and I've allowed it to simmer for about 10 minutes to cook out any raw flour taste, so we can go ahead and strain this one out now too. And with that, these can be set aside, so let's pull the meatloaf out of the oven so we can apply the first layer of glaze. And for the glaze today, I'm going to keep it simple and just go with ketchup, but there are pretty much unlimited options if you did want to add to it. Brown sugar and honey will sweeten it up, vinegar or Worcester sauce will give it a little bit of tang, and sometimes I like to chop up chipotle chilies out of a can to add a little bit of heat to it. But regardless of what you go with, brush a thin layer onto the outside of the meatloaf and place it back into the same 375-degree oven as earlier. And now let's turn our attention to our green beans. And for them, place a pot of water over high heat and add a pinch of salt to the pot. And when the water reaches a boil, add a handful of green beans to the pot. So what I'm doing with these green beans is referred to as blanching or par cooking. And I'm going to cook them until they are tender yet crisp. And this is referred to as al dente, meaning firm to the tooth. And this is how restaurants cook green vegetables. They blanch them just like this and then plunge them into ice water, which immediately stops the cooking. And then when it comes service time, they reheat them, usually by sauteing them. And contrary to what some people say, this blanching process does not set or stabilize green pigments in any way. They can still be overcooked just as easily. So know that if you're getting that dull olive green color on your vegetables, it's because you're overcooking them, so don't cook them as long. Okay, these have been boiling for about 5 minutes now, and you can see that they are tender and pliable, but they still have their bright green color, so these can be strained out now. So with the green beans out of the way, let's apply another layer of glaze to the meatloaf, and this part is pretty self-explanatory, just repeat the same process as earlier. Apply a thin layer of glaze to the outside, and this is the last layer of glaze that we're going to be applying, so once you put the meatloaf back into the oven, we can start putting together the final components of our dinner. So start by placing a saute pan over medium heat and add some chopped up bacon to the pan. And while that's rendering out, place the pot of potatoes into the oven to dry them out. This is an extra step that restaurants do to make mashed potatoes better. And when the bacon has rendered out and become crispy, add a small amount of onions and sweat them out until they turn translucent and soften up. Then add 1 to 2 garlic cloves, cook that for another minute, and toss in the green beans. Give it a few stirs or tosses and set that aside. And for the mashed potatoes, add 4 tablespoons of butter or a half a stick, along with 5 ounces of heavy cream, a pinch of salt, and a few dashes of white pepper. And after adding these ingredients, the potatoes are ready to be mashed up. And for the ratio on these, I started with 20 ounces of potatoes, so 20 ounces to 5 ounces of cream and 4 tablespoons of butter. And when mashing these, they might seem a little sloshy at first, but work them for a minute or two and they will come together, but don't overmix them. Overmixed potatoes can take on a gluey consistency. Alright, I've taken the meatloaf out of the oven while you weren't looking, so with everything done, let's slice the meatloaf up and put the plate together. When slicing into this thing, the resting period that I mentioned earlier, along with keeping the vegetables small should allow for cohesive slices that stay intact like you see here. So layer a few slices onto a plate of your choosing, follow that up with a portion of green beans, and make sure to snag some of the bacon and onions too. Add a portion of mashed potatoes and make a little well in the center to finish them off with a little bit of gravy. And with that, I greatly appreciate your viewership and support of the channel. But for now, we've reached the end of the video, so thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.